Hello and welcome to the second edition of the Springboard Studios podcast, published by Falmouth University. For the benefits of those listeners who haven't yet listened to, and I would strongly recommend that you do listen to our first episode, it might be useful just to give you a little bit of project context. So, Springboard Studios is Falmouth University's contribution to the Healthworks Cornwall project, funded by the European Social Fund. Our project very much uses the evidence that participating in place-based, non-assessed, creative activities in coastal locations across Cornwall can improve our students' well-being, their confidence and their opportunity to transition into employment after university with confidence. The project has had a number of programmes, and this week I am delighted to be joined by collaborators Dion and Steve House from Graphic Design, who will talk about their involvement in the project. So, as I said, I'm delighted to be joined by Dion and Steve House, collaborators on Springboard Studios, possibly over the last 2 years. So, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, hello, thank you.
Absolute pleasure. It might be useful for the benefit of the listeners. There's a couple of things I think in terms of your creative and teaching learning practices that I think would be useful to bring into the conversation at this point in time to give the listeners a bit of context. Dion, I'm aware of your book that you wrote, and Steve, I'm aware of your MA, your book around creativity, and Steve around your MA, which, as I understand it, was exploring kind of non-assessed education. Dion, I'm going to start with you. Would you mind just telling the listeners a little bit about your book and where it came about and what inspired it and what it discusses?
Yeah, sure. So the book's a collaboration with another colleague of ours, Andy Neal. Andy's been teaching over 20 years. I've been teaching around 10 years. And together we had a shared interest in design process, the creative process. Ran a series of workshops together and realised at a certain point that actually there was probably a book in what we had a shared interest in. And that interest essentially is about the student identity, and about how important that is in forming your creative process, the habits that you have and how they impact your process as well. And really importantly, play. That's a big part of my teaching is sort of play theory, and how all of those things, if you put the student at the centre of their journey, it can have a really transformative effect. So yeah, we wrote a book together a couple of years ago now. It's published by Lawrence King Publishing, called Creativity Begins With You.
Perfect, thanks. It almost sounds a bit like Steiner education that really focuses on the kind of inner child and building a curriculum around their needs and their interests rather than a curriculum as such. And Steve, tell us a little bit about your MA.
My interest in looking at assessment stems from what I've seen as a teacher over the last sort of 12 years, where many students feel an incredible amount of pressure to perform under assessment, and even in this creative arts education scenario, where you might imagine that things would be a little more tailored towards the student's well-being and putting the journey of the creative process at the heart of everything. We're still trapped in this paradigm of having to assess kind of everything that the student does. And I suppose there's an important caveat to what you said earlier. I'm not only interested in non-assessment, I'm interested in correct assessment that helps the student and the teacher to understand that journey and doesn't put either party under undue stress or pressure. And that's one of the things that I looked at on my MA. I ran a series of studies asking students and staff to share their experiences, and overwhelmingly people felt negatively towards aspects of that assessment process, which is at odds with what we're trying to achieve as our particular institution at Falmouth, but in the wider context of creative arts, higher education.
Absolutely, and I think those shared interests around creativity and play and fostering curiosity, which play does, are all at the heart of Springboard Studios. So it's great that we're in a room together talking about it. I think it'd be useful for the benefit of the listeners if you could both, together or individually, just describe, your involvement in Springboard Studios, maybe some of the activities that you've been involved in, because I know that Dion, you've been involved in some, that Steve hasn't, and vice versa. We've collaborated on various things, and kind of why you got involved. Who wants to start?
Maybe I'll start. Dion's looking at me in a strange way, so I'm going to start talking. Well, we first got involved together. I know you've done some other things with Sasha, Dion, you can expand on, but together our involvement was 2.5 years ago now. We first ran a summer school, which was the first version of it was called Design for Good, and we involved a number of different alumni who are now working in senior roles in the industry to come back and mentor our students who would work in small studio groups. We worked alongside 4 different partners from local charitable organisations, all of whom expressed a need and a desire to both work with students and benefit from their expertise. And we found that the students going through that process, their confidence was really transformed, partly because of the mentorship and the support that was given to them by the invited industry folks, but more than that, it was because the pressure was released. There wasn't as much pressure to perform under any sort of assessment context, and there was a huge amount of value in just the interactions that they had and the work that they produced, none of which was assessed in any sort of formal context.
I mean, one of the key reasons why I think it was successful is the nature of the immersion, the fact that they're, spending that much time, with people who are a little bit further ahead on the journey in the design industry. You can't really kind of recreate that at in a university course. So to do it in the way that we did it as a part of this summer school, we were able to really focus on that sort of immersive quality of it. And I think part of why I think that's successful is the kind of human connections that are made. And quite often, in academic life, it's the last thing to be considered. It's the sort of human at the centre of it all. And actually, it's those conversations that are outside of the traditional learning, when people are having a coffee or when they're walking from one place to the next. That actually, they're the really vital moments where the mentorship was really valuable to those students.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that's come through from Springboard Studios is having facilitators or mentors that are relatable to the students. And I think your point is that they were relatable in the next steps. And rather than that being a formal Q&A, where some of those students that might lack confidence or the self-esteem to ask those questions can have it in that immersive experience. The other thing that I should add was at the heart of the creation of the summer school was not Steve, Dion and I sitting in a room and going, what does this look like? We got the students together and asked them how they would benefit from their next steps. So very much it was a co-designed summer school with the students, and it was really interesting that a theme that came through that co-designed session was the notion of the students wanting to do something altruistic for their local community before they left university, hence the kind of working on a charitable brief. Dion, did you want to talk about any of the other activities that you've been involved in, such as the amazing walk that we did with Mickey?
Yeah. Maybe just to go back a tiny bit before that, actually, thinking about the kind of human-centred nature of it all. I mentioned I was interested in play theory and looking at, how to kind of, how we can sort of relax the environment in university life. A couple of years ago, I came up here to Amata, actually spoke to some of your colleagues on theatre and dance, and was sort of amazed by their daily routine of getting up here, spending a couple of hours sort of working with their body. And it really made me realise, coming back to the sort of studio environment where we see graphic designers sat at a desk, 9 to 5, there's so many cliches, so many sort of mantras that will tell you that movement is very, very important to the creative process, but it doesn't matter how much we say it to students, they're not sort of taking that in. And I just sort of really think it's really important that whatever your creative discipline, focusing on the body is quite important. So I have been quite interested in how walking can inform creative practice, and I know we've talked before about this project where we take academics and artists for a walk with students in a blue space, which is part of your research as well. So after chatting to you, it was really great to be invited to be part of that and invite Mickey Smith and a group of students to go for a walk in Batalic to hear about how the sea informs and shapes his practice, and to take them out of an academic context where they're meeting someone who his work is very intuitive as opposed to sort of from a textbook. It was really, really fascinating to see how they responded to that. in that blue space, and going for a walk with someone like that.
It was really interesting. I've just remembered a kind of a moment of inspiration when we finished the first summer school, and I was like, what next, what next, what next? And it was you, Dion, that said, we should walk, talk, create and debate. And in the kind of first phases of the project, it was very much about embedding the 5 steps to well-being in our projects, but not telling students that, to stigmatise it as some sort of therapy, giving, noticing the world around us, being active, learning new things and connecting to the others. So it was kind of subtly embedded in it. And then I came across this book called Blue Mind by Professor Wallace Nichols that talks about the impact of blue space on mental health and how it creates a mindset that's curious, connected, calm, collaborative and creative. Isn't it? We're an HE institution that's surrounded by this stuff. So how can we capitalise on the 5 steps to wellbeing and this notion of place-based learning, which is immersed in this place, which also nurtures a mindset that's blue? And it was actually when I was walking the coast path with the dog that I had this moment, and I remember having to drive down to graphics and just go, Steve, I've got to talk to you. What does this look like? So yeah, the notion was we would take students to walk, create, debate in coastal locations with academics and artists talking about place and how it informs their practice, but hopefully improving student wellbeing. And then that led to this year's summer school. But I might let you guys talk about that, because it was quite a different experience, wasn't it?
It was. And just to pause momentarily, just a lot of our students from graphics took part in those walks. Some in particular were able to take part in all of them, I think, and honestly they spoke so glowingly about the experience and what it meant to them to get out into those green and blue spaces, and also to just meet all these different creative people with different practices, different perspectives. And they were really able to weave in some reflection on that into the work they produced in third year that really not only strengthened their work, but strengthened their confidence. So it was amazing to see that. Just wanted to mention that. So the summer school in its second iteration was a little different. We wanted to build on what you were saying there, Sasha, about students wanting to give something back, and really making sure that the work that we did in this summer school, although we did this with the first one too, but very much was about purpose-driven. There was no profit motive whatsoever in terms of the type of client or the type of business or organisation that we might partner with. So we were able to partner with Surfers Against Sewage, which absolutely resonated so much with all the students that took part in it. They were aware of that organisation already, and were absolutely thrilled at the opportunity to say something about this incredibly awful water pollution issue that we all face. And obviously Surfers Against Sewage are really prominent in raising awareness about that, highlighting some of those issues. So the students absolutely were thrilled at the prospect of working with Surfers Against Sewage. And again, we were in a fortunate position to bring in alumni, people who are doing things in industry that are really impressive, some of whom are based locally. We had a couple of people who were working at local design studios, and others that came from further afield. And the whole spirit of it was just like building on what had happened in the first one. The first one was great. It's like the second time around we were able to sharpen up and just make sure everything was ticking along perfectly. And it was a pleasure to be involved in, and a pleasure to see how much the students got out of it.
Dion, is there anything that you wanted to add to this year's summer school? Maybe?
I think, Steve, you've done very well there, Steve, in terms of describing our approach to it. I think, in terms of how we sharpened it up, I think there was a sense to kind of, again, I keep repeating myself about the sort of human condition, trying to take away any moments where there could be stress built up, and mental health is obviously a really big part of what this project's all about. And it doesn't matter how hard you try. There's always things that you can do that will create stress in an environment. So we worked really, really hard to try and remove that and take away, hard-edged, competitive nature of what maybe was happening in the previous year. But I think it was really successful. The student feedback was incredible, really, for that project, and it kind of makes us really think how much of that we can fold into what we do at degree level. I mean, it would be great to do much, much more work in that form if possible.
Absolutely, and the feedback from Surfers Against Sewage themselves was quite outstanding, really. And the fact that Steve and I and Dion were invited back to Surfers Against Sewage to present to the entire team. That's how impressed they were. And as a consequence, they're sincerely thinking about how they can embed these campaigns that can help them diversify their audience and member base into their work. So what an amazing opportunity for students to have actively worked with a globally recognised blue space regeneration charity. Dion, you touched on it a little bit. It'd be interesting from your perspective to think about Springboard Studios and whether it's had an impact on your teaching and learning going forwards.
Yes. I mean, obviously the sort of mental health angle is where I'm sort of coming from, and I guess it's where we all need to come from at the moment. I've been teaching 10 years and mentally I've been plotting a graph in my mind of how many students are talking to me about mental health, and you can imagine that, you know, that graph, the line's shooting up, and that's been exacerbated obviously by the pandemic and everything else that's going on in the world at the moment. So we really need to be doing something about it, and so a lot of this work around sort of the blue mind, I think we'd be foolish not to take advantage of that. I mean, I took advantage of that yesterday, actually meeting a group of students for one-to-ones. We did it through a walk along the coast, because then we can move rather than sat in a room with white walls where our brain's not moving around. So students are valuing that. It's not a gimmick, it's real. We keep reiterating to students that, you know, here's the evidence for this stuff, let's do it. If as a byproduct it makes you feel good, then that's great. But we're not doing it for it to be fun. We're doing it because it works. The fun is just a nice byproduct of it.
Oh, that's really amazing to hear that you're kind of embedding that on a kind of daily basis into, and it gives the students the opportunity to say, we can also do this, can't we? One of the students said something really interesting in some feedback session, that the thing they liked about these learning experiences, as we're calling it, is it kind of took the pressure off kind of, you know, that face-to-face formed kind of conversations that sometimes lectures and seminars encourage, whereas when you're walking you haven't got that, how am I trying to describe this, but you haven't got that kind of forced communication, which can sometimes be quite challenging and awkward for some students. So I really like the fact that you're doing that with your tutorials in that format.
I mean, it actually wasn't even a planned session. It was just at the beginning of the session I could tell there was a student who was feeling particularly vulnerable and feeling particularly unable to make eye contact, and I clocked it quite quickly. So I said, actually, we're going to do something different today, and it was sort of overwhelmingly kind of embraced by the students, and like you say, it does give them permission. Then, okay, I can do this, and you know, going back to what I was saying earlier about focusing on the body, you know, it's almost criminal that we're not doing that in this type of creative education. That's where our creativity comes from. So if we're not looking after it, and if we're not thinking about how we're using our bodies in a creative space, then we're making a mistake, really, with this job.
I was talking to some technical theatre arts students this morning about kind of creativity and where our creative ideas come from, and from experience of students forcing those kind of creative ideas in quite frankly non-creative spaces, and I'll just say stop. Go for a walk. And I think my example earlier was that's when I had that moment when I wasn't forcing it. It was just kind of digesting and letting some of those things manifest without forcing them to come out, which I think Pete talks about in the film, which we can share with people. How about you, Steve, in terms of Springboard Studios and whether there's things that you might take from it in terms of your teaching and learning, or even your own creative practice?
Yeah, there's lots and lots of influential things. One thing I would say about what you're saying, you know, both of you really are alluding to the idea of getting out of a studio space or a workspace or whatever and just getting out into nature. From my earliest experiences since graduating of working both in London and Sydney, all the good studios that I worked at, all the places that really nourished the people who worked there and mentored them and, you know, gave a shit about whether we were doing okay or not, would encourage, after any sort of like big brief landed in the studio or in any sort of super stressful scenario was coming up, that you didn't have to be chained to your desk, that you should go out into your environment, go for a walk, go and watch a film, do whatever, and let, you know, whatever problem you're processing, be it creative, commercial, whatever, just let that percolate in the back of your mind and don't try and solve it immediately, and just relieve the pressure a little bit. And so some of the things we're talking about are actually seen as good practice in the industry. And it does seem slightly bonkers that in an educational setting such as this, we might not heed some of that sort of thing. We need to really let people have a bit of time and space to process what we're asking them to do. And when it comes to the processing of what we're asking them to do, let them be free to be playful and to be making and go off on various tangents before, considering what that outcome might be or might not be. One of the problems with the way that we assess in HE is that we're all focused so much on specific outcomes being handed over at the end, and that doesn't always mirror how people work in their own creative practice in the real world. It can be a long meandering journey and something isn't finished immediately, and there's a lot of value in that. It doesn't always have to be quickly concluded. But one of the things I would say that I've embedded in my teaching practice, having gone through these summer schools, is just letting people take charge of their own direction, I suppose, is one of the things. Like, give them a sense of agency over what they're studying or choosing to be involved in, and to try not to be too prescriptive in, first of all, what people should be studying and how they should be doing it, but also specific timelines. Like, one student might need more time than another. And I think one of the other things that we're not very good at, on our course at least, maybe can't talk about the wider institution, is differentiating to the needs of different students. From a pedagogic point of view, it's absolutely imperative that you recognise that there are different learning styles, different needs, different ways to process information. And in our own cohort in the final year, we've got 78 students. We've got 78 different learning styles, 78 different ways of wanting to learn and engage with the world. So, I would say that it's reinforced to me how important it is that every individual has their own needs, has their own preferences, and given the right support and the right kind of sensitivity, they can make amazing work. But if we try and push them all into the same box, it isn't going to suit them.
I think just to add to that as well, we've got 78 students who've got a different metric for what success looks like, which also needs to factor into that as well.
Absolutely. I read an interesting article recently which is about place-based learning, which kind of builds on what we've been talking about, and it evidences that participating in place-based learning, whether that's the curriculum being delivered somewhere else or a different curriculum being delivered in a different place, can nurture all those things that you're saying, agency in student and social capital both internally and externally. And it was interesting that some of your students in particular, where you've got large cohorts, were saying that they hadn't even met students on their course, and this gave them the opportunity to meet other students on their course that they hadn't met when they were in third year, on learning experience where they had shared purpose. So really interesting. Why do you think these types of initiatives are important and needed? And maybe thinking about from your students' perspective, what do you think the impact has been for them on their learning journey?
I think it's interesting to consider, like, where we've been running these summer schools. It comes at a vital moment, I would say, for they've literally just finished their whole period of study in third year. They've been under intense pressure. We try and make it as enjoyable as it can be, but the reality is you're concluding your degree with the body of work you're producing in third year. And no matter how much fun we try and make it and how sort of collaborative and open we make it, they feel the pressure on their shoulders, because once this degree finishes, for many of them, that's the end of a very long journey that they've been on in education. And then the doors are slightly opening towards something that comes next that they haven't got a huge amount of experience of pursuing a career, so they're feeling a bit nervous. And so from the point of view of the summer school landing where it does, it transforms their ability to see themselves as creative, confident, able to interact with other people in industry. It really does open a door that otherwise might be seen as a barrier. So it happens at a vital time for them.
Yeah, it's that kind of, that making the next step both achievable, realistic, relatable. It's that in-between gap, isn't it, that we're kind of curating and creating for the students to develop, their sense of professional confidence. Yes, I can actually do this in the real world because I have.
I think as well, again, about the time that it actually takes place, it's like a little bit of after sales care from us in a funny kind of way. We're sort of making them aware that we are we're still with them on that journey wherever they're going next. We're sort of trying to help them get there rather than you finished, out the doors and you're gone. So I think that's valuable to us to kind of strengthen that relationship, because that's kind of why we're doing this type of work, is to build and foster those kind of relationships.
I think it's also extremely important that the university notices how transformative that non-assessed period of learning is for the student.
Yeah, absolutely.
And perhaps whether this university can become a sort of an influence on others to look at projects of this nature and see how successful they've been, and realise that I know there are all sorts of contexts around quality assurance and the need for some student activities to be assessed, etc., etc. But I am convinced anyway that whether it's this uni or another, somebody at some point is going to take up that baton and say, we're going to make a real point of less assessment or less heavy assessment, recognise that the needs of the student are paramount. We're in this kind of mental health scenario where so many people are struggling, like Dion's alluding to. There's many people that we come across day to day who are feeling very anxious, and it's not all about how we're structuring things at uni. There's all sorts of stuff going on in life, in society, that influences that. But if, as a university and the wider HE sector, is talking about putting student wellbeing absolutely at the forefront of everything that we do, and supporting those students to the best advantage so that they can actually thrive and go forward into careers that are nourishing and beneficial, we have to realise that the assessment processes that we apply to those same students are negatively impacting their wellbeing. And if we don't join those dots, I don't know who else is going to do it. It's all there in front of us to see the detrimental impact that some of our assessment practice has on our students, at the same time as we're trying to talk about supporting them as best we can for their wellbeing.
Yeah. I mean, if you put that on a slightly longer timeline as well, and if that, if the rise in mental health continues to rise as it is doing so now, it's going to get to a point where we'll have to make that change, because there are times through the periods of assessment where you do feel that you're making people ill, not just the students as well. The kind of the systems that are set up can lead to sort of impacts with staff mental health as well. So, something needs to happen, something needs to change. Otherwise, it's sort of getting to a point where it's criminal if we don't make a change. And not just for mental health. I mean, when you're thinking about when you're sort of helping nurture creativity, the one thing that stops creativity in its tracks is stress. And so if the number one contribution to that stress or factor of causing that stress is the assessment, then that's the thing that needs to move or change. And I find it remarkable. I work in an institution full of amazing people, really, great talent, innovators everywhere. But people are so sort of blind to seeing how this can change, and people are sort of so happy with the status quo. So when I meet people like Steve or like yourself, who do see that and are kind of willing to embrace it, I'm lost my thread there where I'm trying to go, but it makes me. I feel reassured when I see like-minded individuals like that, because so many people in higher education are just happy with the status quo.
I think it's also really important to say that we don't need to advocate for like the abolition of assessment. Assessment at its core is a vital part of how people learn and how we know what journey the student is on, and track our teaching for its relative merit or not, the impact that it's having, etc. But even a tiny sort of incremental shift away from summative assessment to leaning much more heavily on forms of, formative assessment, ongoing assessment throughout the learning journey, that feels a lot less heavy as a burden to carry for both the student and the staff, and yet reveals as good as, if not better, picture of attainment and progress. That's an easy change to make, I think, and to stay within the bounds of quality assurance and having to carry out some of these assessments. So I think whether we can lead on that as a course, or whether it's a wider institutional thing or beyond, I just think it's so important to recognise the negative impact that very regular, very heavy summative assessment can have on the student experience.
And I think there's other interesting ways that you could think about assessment so it doesn't have a negative impact on wellbeing and your creative potential and unlocking that creative potential through play, student-centred learning, place-based learning, all of those things that we're talking about, such as, you know, embarking on a creative project that meanders, as you said, Steve. You don't know where it's going to go. It's playful, it's exploratory, you're trying lots of different things, but you're not assessed on that. But maybe you reflect on that, and maybe that's what's the bit that's assessed. Because actually, as practitioners, that's what we should be doing in our careers going forward, is like reflecting on a client brief. Why couldn't I work on that? Why did I struggle with that? And actually, that is a valuable tool, I think, going forward, because we're not always assessed on our creativity when we leave the institution, but being able to reflect on your working processes or your practice, etc., I think could be quite valuable.
Yeah, and another thing that we sell to students quite rightly is that going through this process on any of our courses, part of what you're getting is a preparedness to thrive in a career setting afterwards. And in my experience anyway, in all sorts of studios in the UK and in Australia, I don't think there's been any instance where the kind of work that I was creating would be judged in a way that it has been judged in university. What you get in a studio setting, and I'm talking now about graphic design, it may be different for other pathways, I realise, but it's ongoing formative dialogue between other members of your team in the studio, so peer-based formative feedback, and you've got client-based formative feedback, and it's never about the actual end result being, qualitatively and quantitatively assessed at the end of the journey. It's never about that. It's always ongoing throughout the life of the project. So if we want to prepare our students to thrive in contemporary creative practice, we need to be talking to them that actually this formative approach is exactly what you're going to find in industry.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Steve and Dion. So, are there any kind of final words on kind of the importance of non-assessed creative education from your perspectives?
I think it's important to note that the way that we concluded both of those summer schools involved the students organising the work that they had created during that week and then presenting it to their clients in both of those different settings, to their peers, to invited industry guests, to us and then other staff members. So it wasn't that the project was free of pressure, and it wasn't that the project was unconcluded. It was very much concluded, and there was a lot of pressure actually to perform and do a great job of presenting what they had produced. And I think it's worth noting that that is actually a form of assessment in itself, but it's a very nourishing form of assessment, and there's no reason we've just revalidated or are in the process, of revalidating as a course. It hasn't all been signed off yet. But one of our proposals is that some of the methods of assessment would be very similar to that. It would be about the students' personal reflection on their process, and it would be about a presentation to their peers and to staff of what they feel they have achieved in that period. So in that way, we are mirroring some of the best of what we achieved with Springboard Studios.
Yeah, I think that in itself was the success. We just didn't measure it like we normally do with assessment. And actually, success for me also looks like giving the students that next step, which helps them on their creative journey. Because that is part of it, isn't it? That's what success looks like for me. You know, what are the barriers going forward, and how can we help you so that you have got that professional confidence going forward? Any final words, thoughts from you, Dion?
I mean, just very briefly, the value of the reflection and the value of the feedback is that's where all the good stuff is. It's the unit of measurement that I have a problem with, and it's the unit of measurement that causes the stress, which leads to the people shutting down creatively or productively. So yeah, echo absolutely everything that you're saying and Steve's saying, and stop.
But also, just one final thing, we're all agreed, I'm sure everyone in this university agrees, that the student experience is at the heart of what we do, right? We want them to have an amazing journey, learn all sorts of brilliant things, and then impress us with their new knowledge and go out into industry and be influential and do new things. And the way to do that is to reduce the assessment burden and make them feel like they are really free to do the work that they're passionate about and not be pushed into little boxes and ticked against this criteria and that criteria. So if we're saying that we want the students to leave this place fully equipped and full of confidence, let's just assess them less.
Absolutely. Out of interest, how many design studios, when they're appointing graduates, do you think are interested in their mark?
None.
They want to see their portfolio.
It's all about the portfolio and how they present it.
Well, and even beyond that, it's how they are in the room as well. So it's again, it comes back to how they are as human beings, how they can deal, how they can communicate. So yes, the work gets them in the door, but it's how they are once they're in the room that's really, really important.
So then,
I was just going to say, and I think, it felt to me that a long time ago, universities were a protected space where you were kind of shielded a little bit from the sort of pressures of industry. But actually now universities come with their own pressures that feel too great. And actually industry can actually lead the way and make when it comes to mental health. So I think we're a little bit behind industry on how we're kind of acting. And I think we need to be a little bit more proactive in what we're doing.
It would be interesting, wouldn't it, to open up a conversation with industry. And obviously there are very different industries within the institution. Film, TV operate, possibly quite differently to graphics, but bring industry in and say, how can we assess the students in a way that is meaningful for them in their journey going forwards, but also isn't going to have a negative impact on their mental health, and get that spin from them?
I think if you ask most people in industry, this is only anecdotal, but based on our shared experiences over many years working in the industry, literally no one in our specific discipline of graphic design and its related fields, literally no one cares what grade you got. So if we know that to be true, why don't we just run a course that is a pass-fail? If you participate and you engage, you pass it. If you don't participate for some reason that's been unexpected, then maybe you don't pass it. But for the vast majority of students, they would pass it and they would produce a body of work that was more than sufficient to open doors in industry.
That's it, isn't it? Any final words from either of you?
Thanks for having us in today, Sasha. It's been great to work with you.
Yeah.
Yes, I've really enjoyed working with you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I really sincerely hope that you get to do more of the brilliant stuff that you've been doing with Springboard.
Oh, me too. And hopefully that it will foster future collaborations with you both in graphic design. So thanks again, Steve and Dion, for being here this afternoon. Brilliant. This podcast has been part funded by the European Social Fund.